All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are in southern Wyoming. We're in the wonderful city of Laramie, and we're at the University of Wyoming at the Geological Museum. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to Mr. Brent Breithaupt.
Hi, Arnold.
Thanks for inviting us.
My
Thanks for
pleasure.
having us. Tell us a little about your museum, will you?
Thanks for coming here, and I'd love to. Outside of our museum, we have this life-size statue that was done by one of the professors at the University of Wyoming named Sam Knight. This particular dinosaur here is known as a Tyrannosaurus rex. This is a life-size statue, as you see here. Now, a lot of people know this particular dinosaur these days because it was highlighted in the popular film Jurassic Park. As you can see, this animal stands about 16 to 18 feet tall, is about 47 feet long, and probably weighed about 7 tons. Take a look at the mouth of this animal, a ferocious predator that once roamed the plains of Wyoming. Fortunately, we don't have any of these around today. But at one time, approximately 70 million years ago, this animal roamed this area of Wyoming and other parts of the Rocky Mountain West. If we take a look at this animal, it's important to keep in mind that we like to do comparisons as paleontologists between this animal and other animals, and we'll be doing that throughout the tour today. So if you take a look at the head of this animal, take a look at the neck, the arms, main part of the body, the back legs, and the tail, these are the sorts of things that we as scientists look at for comparison purposes, to figure out just how these animals might have lived millions of years ago when they once occupied Wyoming. Let's go on inside and we'll talk about some other dinosaurs. Another very unique dinosaur that we have in Wyoming is this one here, known as Brontosaurus. However, that name is somewhat incorrect because this dinosaur was named more than once. The first name that was given to it was Apatosaurus. That was a name that was given in 1877 to this particular kind of dinosaur. A couple of years later, the same scientist that named it Apatosaurus found another discovery and named it Brontosaurus. Well, what scientists do when in fact in the rare cases where fossils are named more than once is they try to use the first name that was given to it. So this dinosaur is actually should be better called an Apatosaurus. Well, unfortunately, this particular dinosaur is very well known by its more common name, or the second name, which is Brontosaurus. So today I might be referring to it as Apatosaurus or as Brontosaurus, and you might hear about this particular dinosaur either as Brontosaurus or Apatosaurus in the news or many books that are being written these days. So just keep in mind that it is in fact the same animal. Now this animal here is quite unique. It stretches the length of the museum about 70, 75 feet long, probably weighed about 20 or 30 tons. Quite an impressive animal that also once roamed Wyoming, in this case about 150 million years ago. If we take a look at this animal here, we're looking at something different than the statue outside. The statue was made from taking a look at different kinds of bones of a Tyrannosaurus rex. Here is, in fact, the actual skeleton of an Apatosaurus. And we start at the head end of this animal. We take a look at its mouth. And scientists try to figure out something about dinosaurs, try to think about something about these animals. Well, in fact, we don't have any 70-foot animals roaming around on land today. We don't have any dinosaurs around today. So, what did they eat? How did they live? Well, let's take a look at the head end of this animal and try to figure that out. We take a look at the teeth. The teeth aren't long, sharp points like they were in the Tyrannosaurus that we saw outside. Remember, we're going to be doing some comparisons between the different animals that we see in the museum today. So these teeth here are very good for eating some sort of plant. These are plant eaters' teeth. They wouldn't have been good for ripping and tearing through other animals like the Tyrannosaurus rex's teeth. Now, what kind of plants might this animal have been eating? When we take a look at the next part of this animal, we take a look at its neck. It's got a long, long neck. What animal today that we see has a long neck and reaches up and eats leaves off the tops of trees? In fact, giraffes do that. So the front end of this animal is in fact very, very giraffe-like. So scientists believe that this animal probably spent a lot of time reaching up and eating the leaves off the tops of trees. So now we have a little bit of a story about how this animal might have eaten and what it might have eaten. In fact, we've never seen one of these animals eat anything, but that's how we put together that story. And that's how paleontology works. We have the bones, we have the teeth, But we have to make some guesses and some assumptions as to how these animals might have lived on our Earth millions of years ago. If we also move down this animal to the next part here, and I'm going to get into the display here itself. What's very unique about this dinosaur, as well as a lot of the animals that we take a look at, is that we can recognize specific bones within this animal that are similar to bones in our body. And one of the questions that I get asked quite often is, how do we know how to put these animals together? How do we know where the bones go in the animal's body? Well, if we realize that this animal is put together just like you and just like me, that helps out a lot. So, we can recognize the head. Okay, we know where the head would go on an animal. Okay, what's the next set of bones down? The neck, just like on ours. Well, sure enough, we've talked about those parts of this animal already. Okay, the next part gets a little bit tricky. We've got these bones here. Which ones would these be on a person? Head, neck, shoulders. Sure enough, these are the shoulder blades. And these are the shoulder blades of the Apatosaurus. And what's attached to the shoulder blades? In people, it would be our arms. In a Brontosaurus, it would also be the arms. In fact, front legs are arms. And in all animals that walk on their front legs, they in fact have arms. They just use them for walking. So sure enough, this bone here is very similar to this bone on me. These two bones down here are very similar to these two bones on me. And what's at the end of my arm? 5 fingers. How many fingers does a Brontosaurus have? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 5 fingers. 10 fingers in all. But these fingers and these arms and those back legs and those toes are used for holding up an enormous beast. A beast whose name means thunder lizard or Brontosaurus. The reason for that, perhaps every time it took a step, it might have shook the ground when it walked. But keep in mind that not all dinosaurs were big. Some dinosaurs were no bigger than me. Some dinosaurs were no bigger than chickens. So they came in all different sizes, from little tiny ones to great big huge ones, to some that were much bigger than this one in the museum. We have another kind of dinosaur, one known as a Brachiosaurus. Set up on the same kind of body plan as this one here, long neck, long tail, big arms and legs, but so tall that its backbone would have been up against the ceiling. So long that its neck would have stuck its head out the front door. So long that its tail would have gone into the back room of the museum. Let's go down to the middle of this dinosaur and talk about some other parts. We've now moved to the middle part of our dinosaur here. And you can see all of the rib bones, just like our ribs. And just like within our chest region, there was an enormous heart, lungs, stomach, guts. All those parts were here at one time. But those parts, as well as the skin and the muscle, have rotted away. We don't find those parts for dinosaurs. And so that's another part about dinosaurs that we really don't know. We don't know a lot about the soft tissues of dinosaurs. So we can only guess at things like what color they were, because we don't find their skin. We find skin impressions, but we don't in fact find the actual skin. The skin has decayed away. So the dinosaurs might have been green, they might have been black, they could have been brightly colored with stripes. We really don't know. Those are some of the things that we don't know about dinosaurs. Let's take a look at the bones here. You can see that the bones are a light-colored brown here and a dark-colored brown over here. Why is that? Because just like many dinosaur skeletons, we didn't find all of this individual. Very often, we don't find all of the animal. Lots of things happen after a dinosaur dies. Scavengers can maybe grab this big back leg and carry it off, chew on it somewhere else. Something like a big Allosaurus might have done that. Smaller animals might be chewing on the bones. The bones may slowly decay away, or they may be carried downstream and deposited someplace else. So there's many reasons why we don't find all of a dinosaur skeleton. In fact, it's very rare to find a complete skeleton. And when we don't, then we need to go to another museum that might have one of these dinosaurs and make copies of the bones. So we've gone to another museum that had these rib bones, that had these hip bones here, that had this back leg, and made copies of those bones for our skeleton here. We know it had all those bones because we found them in other individuals. We just didn't find it in this one here that was found about 60 or 70 miles north of Laramie in 1901. Now, in fact, if we were trying to go to other museums that would have this particular dinosaur on display, there's only 5 places in the world where someone can see this dinosaur. There's only 5 places in the world where a brontosaurus is on display. One of them is here in Laramie, closest to where it lived. All of these skeletons, in fact, that I'm going to talk about came from the Rocky Mountain West here. There's also one in Chicago at the Field Museum of Natural History. There's one at the Carnegie in Pittsburgh. There's one at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. And finally, there's one at the Yale Peabody Museum in New Haven, Connecticut. So those are the 5 places where if you wanted to see a brontosaurus, you could. And we're fortunate enough to have one here at the museum at the University of Wyoming. Now, when these bones are collected, very often they can be very fragmented. And so what you see in front of me here is a little display as to how these bones are taken out of the ground. Once the bones are discovered, we need to very carefully chip away the rock from around the bone till we've got the bone completely exposed. But then what we do is a technique that was developed in the 1800s when the dinosaur collectors were working out in the West here, and that is something known as plaster jacketing. That is to take this bone, which can be very fragile, which can be very fragmented and falling apart, and cover it with strips of burlap that have been dipped in plaster of Paris. And that's what you see on this end of the bone here. So if we were actually taking this particular leg bone out of the ground, what we would do is after we'd exposed it, like you see here, we would take these strips of burlap, dip them in plaster of Paris, and then carefully encase the entire bone. Again, something very similar to what we would see if I had a broken leg. A doctor would do the same thing, would make a cast for my leg. And in this case, if it was on a person, that cast would help keep my leg rigid until it could heal. Well, in this case here, it also keeps the bone rigid, not so that the bone can heal, but so that we can get it back to the laboratory, where we can very carefully work on it and repair it. And if there are any cracks or any cracks forming, we can protect it a lot better that way. Let's move down to the other end of this museum now and talk about some other prehistoric animals. We've talked about a lot of the bones in the dinosaur, which are similar to bones that we have in our bodies. Heads, necks, shoulders, rib bones, back legs, hips. The long tail bones of the dinosaurs are very unlike anything that we would have in humans. But again, we can recognize these bones as being tail bones by comparing them with other animals. And again, that helps us put together this dinosaur. So if we can recognize what kind of bone it is, whether it be a neck bone, a backbone, a rib bone, a tailbone, that tells us where it goes on the body. And you can see in the Apatosaurus here, we have an animal with an enormous tail. And there's a lot of discussion these days as to how this tail was used. Some scientists would have this tail carried in the air. Some dinosaurs would have this tail dragged down the ground. Some scientists say the tail was used as a weapon. So there's a lot of different ideas as to what this tail might have been used for. It may have also been used for fat storage. This animal may have stored a lot of food in its tail. Modern-day reptiles do, in fact, store a certain amount of food in their tail regions. Again, we really don't know because we don't have any animals like this today. But again, it's another part of this very unique animal that once roamed around Wyoming. Well, let's follow this tail around and talk about another animal that lived in Wyoming at one time. Let's talk about this animal here. This is an animal known as a mosasaur. And let's start from the head and go down to its tail again, just like we did for the Apatosaurus, just like we did for the Brontosaurus back here. But let's take a look at what this animal was adapted for. Let's try to figure out where this animal lived when it lived in Wyoming millions of years ago. So we know that the Apatosaurus was walking around on land, eating leaves off the tops of trees. Well, let's take a look at this animal here. We take a look at the mouth of this animal. We see some pretty sharp teeth, Some pretty impressive teeth in this animal's mouth. Probably pretty good for eating some sort of meat. Now, what kind of meat was this animal eating? We take a look at the animal's body and try to figure out what it would have been good for. Well, how it would have lived. Here's its head. Here's its neck again. There's its shoulders, its arms, and again, 5 fingers. 10 fingers in all. But these arms and these fingers aren't used for holding up a big animal. They're not used for reaching up and grabbing or for climbing. You can see the arms are much shorter than my arms, even though the animal's much bigger. The reason for that? This animal's short little arms and short little legs were probably very good for an animal that spent all of its time in the water, paddling around. Take a look at the entire body of this animal. It's very streamlined. It's very fish-like. Using the tail end of this animal for pushing itself through the water, like a fish, like an alligator might do. But unlike alligators, this animal probably spent most of its life in the water. So again, here we have another animal that we're taking a look at, trying to figure out how it lived millions of years ago. We don't have any mosasaurs around today. Their closest living relatives would be some of the large lizards that live in Southeast Asia. But in fact, this animal here, even though it is a kind of lizard, is a very aquatic lizard. So if we go back to its head, what was it eating? Probably some sort of fish, some sort of aquatic meat that would have been swimming around at that time. So here again, we've taken an animal that all we know about it is from its skeleton, and we've pieced together the story of how this animal might have lived in Wyoming at one time. And sure enough, when we take a look at the rocks that it's found in, the rocks are the kind of rocks that are deposited in marine environments. This animal lived in the oceans. Right now, we're 7,200 feet above sea level. The University of Wyoming Geological Museum is 7,200 feet above sea level. When this animal lived here, this area of the world was below sea level. So there's many times in Wyoming's past where Wyoming was underwater. In fact, if we take a look at the geological record of Wyoming, we see times where the seas came in and the seas went out, and the seas came back in and the seas went back out. So Wyoming's environment has changed a lot through time. From a time when we had dinosaurs roaming on land, to a time when we had mosasaurs and other marine reptiles swimming around in the oceans. So there's a variety of different kinds of animals that we had living in the state at one time. Interestingly enough, another interesting animal that lived at the same time as the mosasaurs would be this animal that's right above me. And if we look up, we will see, in fact, another animal that lived at the same time as the mosasaurs. This animal here is known as a pteranodon. A pteranodon is a kind of pterosaur. Again, it is also not a dinosaur. It is a special kind of flying reptile that lived millions of years ago. And in fact, this particular animal here that we see soaring over my head was found in the same rock unit as we found the mosasaur down below here. So we can imagine a time where Wyoming was underwater, where mosasaurs were swimming around, some of them getting to be twice as big as the one that's behind me. And soaring in the skies above these animals were things like the pterosaurs, soaring around like some of the seabirds that we have today. Before we go upstairs to see the other swimming reptiles that lived in Wyoming when Wyoming was once covered over by an ocean, let's take a look at this display here. What this particular exhibit shows is what a mosasaur skeleton might look like when we first find it. So we've just been talking about a reconstructed skeleton of a mosasaur, the one that we have on display. This is how one would look when we first might find it and dig it out of the ground. Again, you can see that these particular skeletons are not all put together ready to be put on display, that they can be somewhat compressed. The bones can be scattered. But what we've allowed the visitor to do in the museum here is actually get up close and to touch the head, the teeth, the backbone, all the way down to the tail of a mosasaur, an animal that lived here millions of years ago. And one of the things we want people to try to do is try to figure out where these parts here are found on the complete skeleton, which is behind me here. Well, the head and the teeth are easy enough, but also we can see the shoulder blades, we can see part of the hip girdle, we can see all the ribs. So this allows the visitor to do a little bit of comparative anatomy. Comparison of these bones here and compare them with the actual animal we have on display here to get a better understanding for, again, how scientists put these together. And if one can recognize what these bones are in this animal, again, we know where they would go when we're putting together the animal for display. We've just been talking about some unique animals that lived in Wyoming at one time, those that lived in the oceans and flew over the oceans millions of years ago. In fact, there are other animals that also lived in the oceans millions of years ago. And that would be represented by the two displays that we have up here on the wall. These are both remains of things known as plesiosaurs. So we've been talking about mosasaurs. That's one particular group of reptiles that was very well adapted for living in the oceans. Plesiosaurs were another group that were well adapted for living in the oceans. And again, if we look at the head of a plesiosaur that probably would have been about 50 feet long, so also a very impressive carnivore that lived here at one time, very long, sharp teeth. We take a look at a smaller form here of plesiosaur, and plesiosaurs, just like the dinosaurs, came in all different shapes and all different sizes. Plesiosaurs are the kind of swimming reptile that most people recognize because they had a fairly long neck relative to the rest of their body and very paddle-like or flipper-like fins for paddling around. So again, these animals also were very well adapted for living in the oceans, probably even more so than the mosasaurs. If we move down here, we'll in fact take a look at another group of animals that also was well adapted for living in the oceans millions of years ago. At the same time we had plesiosaurs, we had mosasaurs, we had these animals here. These are animals known as ichthyosaurs. Ichthyosaurs were another kind of swimming reptile. And of the three kinds of swimming reptiles that we've talked about so far, mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, and now ichthyosaurs, you can see that ichthyosaurs were in fact the most highly specialized of the three. You can see that if we take a look at the skeleton of one of these animals, and we'll take a look at the smaller version here, these animals are very streamlined. They are very fish-like. Again, they were carnivorous animals that lived in the oceans, but they were also the most aquatically adapted of any of the animals that we've seen. So in fact, we take a look at their body, we take a look at their tails, we take a look at their heads, we take a look at their paddles. These animals were very, very fish-like. And if we were to have one today, if we were to take a look at a reconstruction of one of these animals, they would look very fish-like or very dolphin-like in their appearance. So these animals were living in a similar way to modern-day dolphins, many modern-day fish, but in fact they were kind of reptile. And they, the ichthyosaurs, like the plesiosaurs, like the mosasaurs, all went extinct about 65 million years ago. We don't have any of these animals around either. To my left here you see the skull of a dinosaur known as a Camarasaurus. It was another dinosaur that lived at the same time as the Apatosaurus, as the Brontosaurus that we talked about earlier. It also had a fairly long neck, a fairly long tail, and walked on fours, all fours, using its arms as front legs. This animal here has some pretty impressive teeth, but it is also thought to have been a plant eater. Again, reaching up and eating leaves off the tops of trees. But the story of this head goes a little further than that, because it wasn't that long ago that this kind of skull was thought to have been the skull that belonged on an Brontosaurus, on an Apatosaurus. In fact, every museum that had one of these animals on display, that had a Brontosaurus on display, had this kind of skull. every picture of a brontosaurus in any book or any magazine had this kind of skull. Any plastic dinosaur that you bought back in the 70s and before had this kind of skull. Why? Why was that? Well, the reason for that was when Othniel Charles Marsh, professor from the Yale Peabody Museum back in the 1800s, was describing the first brontosaurus. He was trying to write and describe dinosaurs much faster than a rival collector known as Edward Drinker Cope. And he was trying to make certain that he always tried to scoop Cope. He tried to make certain that his discoveries came out first. Well, his collecting crews had come across a virtually complete skeleton of what he was calling Brontosaurus. It was the largest land animal that was known at that time. Back in the 1800s, it was the largest land animal ever known. As I've said earlier, we now know that there were animals like the brachiosaurs that were bigger, but at that time, this was the biggest. Marsh wanted to describe this animal. He wanted to do a restoration of this animal, but he didn't have a skull. What his collecting crews had found was a virtually complete skeleton of this dinosaur. Didn't have a skull, didn't have a head. It did have one tooth associated with it, one tooth that looked like this. So Marsh said to his collecting crews, find me a skull that has those kind of teeth. And in fact, if you find me a skull with these kind of teeth, I'll then have the correct skull for my skeleton so I can do a restoration. Well, his collecting crews said, okay, we'll go find one. And they did. They found this kind of skull. Well, this wasn't necessarily an incorrect assumption because there was almost a complete skeleton of one animal, so that one tooth that was associated with it could have gone with the rest of the animal, but unfortunately it didn't. As we found out much later, actually it wasn't until the 1970s, almost 100 years later, that in fact what Marsh had done, what his collecting crews had done, is they had found a virtually complete skeleton of an Apatosaurus, of a Brontosaurus, but they found one tooth of a Camarasaurus associated with it. So when they found the skull that went with that tooth, they found a Camarasaurus skull. So for a long time, this dinosaur, this well-known dinosaur, Brontosaurus, stood with the skull of a Camarasaurus on it. And one of the first things I did when I came here in the early 1980s was to change the skull to the skull that we have now. Because scientists from the Carnegie Museum had come across part of a skeleton of a Brontosaurus. They had come across the neck region of the Brontosaurus, and they came across a skull associated with that neck region down at Dinosaur National Monument in Utah. And the skull was a lot different from what had been traditionally thought of as the correct skull for this particular dinosaur. They took a look at the field notes, they took a look at Marsh's earlier papers, and they realized what had happened, that he had made this mistake. And so that's why this skull was the kind of skull that I thought went on a Brontosaurus when I was growing up. We now know that it has a dramatically different skull. We've talked about what we traditionally find in the fossil record with regard to dinosaurs. That would be the hard parts, the bones and the teeth. But occasionally we find some other unique fossils that tell us that there were dinosaurs around. And those are dinosaur skin impressions. As I've said earlier, the soft tissues decay away. We don't find those as fossils. But sometimes in a situation where the animal died, the skin left an impression in the surrounding mud or sand prior to decaying away. That sand or mud hardened into either sandstone or mudstone, and we find a natural impression of the dinosaur's skin. What we as scientists are able to do then is to make an accurate copy of what the skin would have been like. And that's what we've done here. We've taken these dinosaur skin impressions that were within the rock, and we've poured in a latex rubber and let it harden so that we can get a very good feeling, literally, of what these dinosaurs felt like. As I said before, we really don't know what color they were. They could have been very bright color too. This is kind of a dull greenish color. But this is very assuredly what many of the dinosaurs felt like. Very beaded kind of scale pattern. And one of the things that we have in this museum that we've tried to do is provide a number of exhibits where people can come in there and feel what perhaps a dinosaur might have felt like, or downstairs, feel what the different bones feel like. So we've tried to give sort of a tactile version of the museum, letting people reach out and touch something to see what these petrified bones feel like, or in this particular case here, what a dinosaur felt like. Next to this particular display here, we have another dinosaur display. And on the wall here, we have the skeleton of a baby dinosaur, probably only about a year old. Had it grown up, it would have been about 30 feet long. It's a dinosaur known as a Maiasaura. It's found up in Montana. It lived in this area of the Rocky Mountain West about 70 million years ago. And this particular kind of dinosaur has been made famous by a paleontologist known as Jack Horner. Jack Horner works up at the Museum of the Rockies and has found not only juveniles, but adults, as well as dinosaur eggs and nests. And down below this particular skeleton here, we have in this case a display on dinosaur eggs and nests. And we're starting to find more and more about juvenile dinosaurs as well as dinosaur nests, how the dinosaurs laid eggs, and a lot about the baby dinosaurs. So we're finding a lot of information in that regard these days. Another kind of duck-billed dinosaur would be one known as a Lambeosaurus. The Maiasaura that we just looked at was in fact also a kind of duck-billed dinosaur. Here's another kind of duck-billed dinosaur, one that lived up in Canada. Lambeosaurus was a very unique kind of duck-billed dinosaur in that it not only had the long, flattened type of snout like many of the duck-bills, but it also had this very specialized crest on top of its head. And what's unique about this crest is, in fact, that it was hollow. This is part of the nose region of this animal. So air would come in here, would travel around inside this crest, and then go down this animal's throat. Now, scientists took a long time trying to figure out what this was used for. It was a very unique adaptation. And again, we don't really have any animals around today that have something like that. And for a while it was thought, well, maybe this animal lived in the water and used it as some sort of snorkeling device or some way to hold air. And then a scientist came up with a very novel idea saying that perhaps it was used as a vocal resonator. That meaning allowing this animal to make some sort of noise by either breathing in or breathing out very quickly. So this area here was actually used as some sort of almost a horn on top of this animal's head. And one particular scientist modeled this and figured out what kind of sounds would have came out. And it would have come out as a low honking sound. So in fact, here again, we're putting together a story about a prehistoric animal. It's no surprise that dinosaurs made some sort of noise. It's difficult to know exactly what that noise would be. But in this case, we can come pretty close to figuring out what kind of noises dinosaurs made. At least these kind of dinosaurs, these kind of duck-billed dinosaurs. If we go over here and take a look at this particular fossil, this is another type of fossil other than bones and teeth that would indicate to us that we have a dinosaur in our area at one time. And what these are dinosaur footprints. And so what happened here is millions of years ago, a dinosaur was walking across a muddy floodplain, left an impression in the mud, continued on walking, didn't realize that its footprints would be preserved for millions of years. So imagine that sometime when you or I walk into the mud and leave a footprint. What happens if that would be preserved for millions of years? Someone would know that we walked there. Well, in this case, we know that some dinosaur, probably some small carnivorous dinosaur, walked through this area at one time. One of the problems with footprints is very simply that we don't know what animal left those footprints for us. So We can see the footprints here. We can say that because of the claws, probably came from a small meat-eating dinosaur, but exactly which one, we really don't know. To my right, beneath my feet, we see another type of footprint. This is from a much larger animal than the one we just saw on the wall. This came from one of the coal mines in the western part of Wyoming, again indicating that a fairly sizable animal, probably an animal about 30 to 50 feet long, roaming in that area about 70 million years ago, stepped in the muck, and that footprint was preserved for millions of years. Now, it's thought that this particular kind of footprint probably came from a fairly large duck-billed dinosaur, the kind of duck-billed dinosaur that we would have in Wyoming, known as an Edmontosaurus. The footprints that we saw upstairs could have come from a variety of different kinds of dinosaurs. It's thought that the small footprints came from one of the small meat-eating dinosaurs we talked about earlier. The very large dinosaur footprint may have come from a kind of duck-billed dinosaur that we find living in Wyoming. And it probably related to this particular animal here, called Edmontosaurus or Ednatosaurus. This dinosaur also has more than one name. And you can see the skull of this animal here. You can see that it's got a long, flattened duck-like bill, lots of teeth in its mouth, just like most of the duck-billed dinosaurs. But unlike the Lambeosaurus that we saw upstairs, which was a Canadian dinosaur, this one here does not have a specialized crest on its nose. Although scientists thought that this animal may have also been able to make some sort of vocalization, some sort of sound, but perhaps from an inflatable nasal sac that wouldn't have preserved in the fossil record. So as you can see, we've got a variety of different kinds of dinosaurs. We started out with our Tyrannosaurus rex that we looked at it outside. We have the Brontosaurus or the Apatosaurus that we've been talking about in the museum quite a bit. We're talking about the duck-billed dinosaurs. We also have things like stegosaurs and ankylosaurs found in Wyoming. In fact, Wyoming has a very rich fauna of dinosaurs. There's lots and lots of dinosaurs found here, and new discoveries are being made every year. In fact, right now, this summer, there's probably some very important discoveries being made. I'm in contact with a fairly regular basis with various scientists that are working in Wyoming finding new discoveries. One of the last dinosaurs we're going to talk about today, before we move on to some other animals, would be the horned dinosaurs, like Triceratops here. Let's go down and take a look at a skull of a horned dinosaur. Some of the last groups of dinosaurs that we had were things like the duckbills, which we've just talked about, as well as the horned dinosaurs, like this one here. The name of this particular dinosaur is Anchiceratops. It, like Lambeosaurus, was a Canadian dinosaur. However, we do in fact have a common relative in Wyoming, and it's known as Triceratops. Triceratops and Anchiceratops were similar in many ways. They had two horns over their eyes, one horn on their nose, and a great big neck shield. It probably helped protect it from the meat-eating dinosaurs like Tyrannosaurus rex that we saw outside. As well, these may have also been used for display, for establishing various types of herds and keeping the status of the herd intact. Approximately 65 million years ago, something happened. We don't know what yet. But we do know that after that point in time, we don't have any more dinosaurs. We don't have any more mosasaurs, or ichthyosaurs, or plesiosaurs, or pterosaurs. All those very specialized groups went extinct. And there's been a lot of discussion as to what happened to those animals. Was it a sudden extinction event, or was it gradual over millions of years? Was there something from outer space that slammed into the Earth that suddenly affected the climate? Or volcanic eruptions that suddenly affected the climate? Or was it a gradual climatic change that happened over millions of years? Again, we still don't know the answer to that. I personally think that it was a gradual climatic change through time that affected not only the animals but the plants. We see dramatic changes at the end of the Mesozoic, the age of reptiles, that are affecting both the animals and the plants. And we see animals gradually going extinct over millions of years. But for whatever reason it might have been, with the extinction of the dinosaurs, we have the diversification of the mammals. And we move from the Mesozoic era, a particular time unit that paleontologists like to talk about, to that what we call the Cenozoic era, which is what we are in now, which is known as the Age of Mammals. And although the largest mammal during the Mesozoic, the Age of Reptiles, was about that of a big house cat, we can see that after the extinction of the dinosaurs, we have a tremendous diversification of the mammals. And in fact, the largest animal to ever live on our planet, great blue whale, is still living today, getting to a weight of 150 tons, dwarfing any of the biggest dinosaurs. Behind me here, you can see a variety of fossilized remains from mammals that lived in Wyoming during the Cenozoic. We have fossils of deer and of pig-like animals, rhino-like animals, early dog relatives, and beavers and camels. Here's one tooth of a woolly mammoth. And we'll talk a little bit about woolly mammoths in a little bit, but you can just see that the size of the teeth, the size of the molar, is quite enormous. One very unique kind of animal that we had living in Wyoming during the Cenozoic were these rhino-like animals called titanotheres. And you can see models of a variety of different kinds of skulls of these animals. So they were quite diverse and around for a long period of time. Here you can see what the skull of one of these animals would have looked like. And they had these very specialized nose horns, probably used in a similar fashion to modern-day rhino horns. But as you can see, one difference between these and a rhinoceros is, in fact, these horns here are actually bony outgrowths of the skull. And so we do find these in the fossil record. If we go over here and take a look at the skeleton of a rhinoceros that lived in Wyoming at one time, we can see that we don't find any evidence of a nose horn. And that's because of what the material is that makes up a rhino horn. It's not an actual outgrowth of the skull, but actually the same kind of material as my hair, very tightly packed together. And that kind of material usually does not fossilize. So here we can see another kind of animal that we had in Wyoming at one time during the Cenozoic, rhinos. We don't have any rhinos in Wyoming today, but there are relatives in other parts of the world. Unlike titanotheres, which are extinct everywhere in the world. We do not have any titanotheres anywhere. If we go over to this display here, it illustrates another kind of fossil animal that we had during the Cenozoic, and we still have today in Wyoming, that being the horse. And we have a very good fossil record of horses, starting at about 50 million years ago, back in the Eocene, and ranging all the way on up to modern-day horses. Here we see a horse that lived in Wyoming approximately 30 million years ago, during a time period that we know as the Oligocene. And you can see that this horse here is relatively small. This is as big as horses got back then. They didn't get any bigger. If you take a look at the front feet, the back feet, you can see that they're walking, these particular animals are walking on 3 hooves as opposed to one single hoof like a modern-day horse. If we were to take a close look at the mouth of this animal, we would see that the teeth are a lot different than the teeth of a modern-day horse. And right above it, we have a display of how the teeth have changed through time in horses. And this probably also reflects where horses lived in relationship to what they were eating. And in fact, somewhere around 20 million years ago, we see an interesting thing happening with regard to fossil vegetation. We see a dramatic increase in the grasses. We see a dramatic development of extensive grasslands. And we see horses moving out from a more browsing kind of existence, eating small shrubs, to taking advantage of this very important and abundant resource, moving out into the open grasslands, and we see an adaptation through time for horses to be more successful in that particular kind of environment. We see a increase in size, longer legs to be a lot quicker, to be able to move in an open space, to be able to avoid predators. We see the teeth changing dramatically through time because grasses are very tough and can wear down the teeth. So we see a very complex tooth pattern evolving through time. And so if we take a look at horses, we can see a coevolution between horses and grasses. It's a really interesting story. So horses started out as small browsing animals 50 million years ago and developed through time to a modern-day horse, which is quite successful, a quite successful grazer on the open grasslands. Now, as we all know, the horses that we see in North America today were reintroduced by the Europeans. So there's an interesting part of this story that you don't see in this particular exhibit here. And that is that we had horses here 50 million years ago. We had horses here 40 million years ago, 30 million years ago, 20 million years ago, 10 million years ago. 10,000 years ago, though, all the horses in North America went extinct. And just like with the dinosaurs, we don't exactly know why the horses went extinct. This is one of the things that scientists are still trying to figure out. Extinction is a very tough issue to deal with. We really don't know why these animals went extinct. But we do know that all horses in North America went extinct about 10,000 years ago and had to be reintroduced into North America from European stocks. So even though the horses that came from Europe probably had ancestors in North America, perhaps horses actually even evolved in North America to begin with and migrated over to the Old World. It was this Old World stock that was used to repopulate the horses that we have in North America today. And if we take a look at the horses in Wyoming, especially those in the wild horse ranges, we can see that Wyoming has always been a good place to be a horse because the wild horse ranges are full of horses. They have more horses in these wild horse ranges than they know what to do with. So Wyoming is a great place for horses today. It was 50 million years ago as well. Let's go talk about some other animals from the Cenozoic. Many of the animals that we had that lived in Wyoming during the Cenozoic lived at a time when it was much warmer, much wetter than we see today. Here we see an example of an animal that lived in Wyoming during the Cenozoic where it was much colder. This is a skeleton of a woolly mammoth, an animal that was found to the west of Laramie outside of the town of Rawlins. And this particular animal here indicates that at one time we probably had these animals, perhaps in herds, traveling through the state. So another kind of animal that we don't have in the state today would be these kinds of ancient elephants. Now we know a lot about woolly mammoths, in particular because up in Alaska and Siberia, complete frozen woolly mammoths have been frozen in the ground, in the permafrost up there. And all the soft parts have been found preserved along with the skeleton. So not only are the bones and the teeth preserved, but also the fur, the skin, the internal organs. We know a lot about woolly mammoths because of the very complete finds that we find to the north. Well, in Wyoming, the ground hasn't been frozen for thousands of years. This animal lived here about 15,000 years ago or so. So the soft parts have decayed away. But when we take a look at the skeleton, we can still see some very important parts that tell us something about this animal. We can see the skull. We can see the two holes on the skull, which is where the nose attached, a long trunk which would have hung down, in between the two big tusks, keeping in mind that tusks are simply upper front teeth that have grown out forward. So this is the elephant's upper front teeth. We looked at, just a few minutes ago, the back teeth, the chewing teeth of a mammoth, and you saw how large those were. So we can see a lot of similarities between a woolly mammoth and a modern-day elephant. In fact, these animals, besides being just a little bit larger and a lot furrier, were very similar in many ways to modern-day elephants that we see today. Scattered around this particular skull here, you can see various parts of the skeleton of this animal that was found south of Rawlins. And what's interesting about this particular discovery, unlike anything else that we have in the museum, is we know how this particular animal died. There were some spear tips There were some other artifacts associated with this particular specimen, and this particular animal appears to have been killed by early Wyoming Native Americans, and parts of it were used for food and parts of it were used for clothing, just like later Indians might use a buffalo. So if we take a close look at some of these bones, particularly this tibia here, the shin bone, we can see hack marks, chop marks, where the early peoples of the state were working away with their primitive tools to get off large pieces of meat for food. So we know a little bit about how this particular animal died. It's kind of, again, kind of an interesting story. So we can see that the Cenozoic in Wyoming also has quite a diversity of animals. The Mesozoic was dominated by the reptiles. The Cenozoic was dominated by the mammals. And we can see a lot of different kinds of animals that lived at different times. Some that we still have relatives of today, and some that have gone extinct. If we go over here, we can take a look at one last Cenozoic animal, one that we have relatives of in the state today, although this particular animal never lived in Wyoming. This particular specimen is from the United Kingdom. This animal is called an Irish elk or an Irish deer. And although similar in many ways to modern-day elk or deer, this animal has the largest antlers, has the largest rack of any animal we know. So it has these enormous antlers that weighed quite a bit. Now the animal itself would probably have been about the size of a Wyoming moose. So it must have had a very, very strong neck musculature just to be able to lift up its head. So these are very, very interesting animals, and ones that a lot of studies are being done on today. In particular, if we take a look at the place where the antlers attach to the skull, this area here, we can see this area here indicates, this area known as the burr, indicates that these antlers were shed from time to time. And if these things were shed, if these antlers were shed, that meant that a whole new growth of these would have to be done very rapidly and require quite a bit of energy be pumped into creating these antlers. So these are a very specialized structure, and these antlers might have grown fraction of an inch every day on this animal's head when it was growing. So these animals here not only had the largest antlers of any animal we know, they probably also had the fastest growing antlers of any animal. Well, besides the different kinds of fossil animals that we have in the state, the Geological Museum also has an array of different kinds of rocks and minerals. Let's go over and take a look at just one of these displays. One of the displays that we have in the Geological Museum that tells a little bit about the story of the various kinds of rocks and minerals that we have in the state is this one here, entitled Diamonds in Wyoming. There's only two places in the United States where diamonds can be found. One of them is in Arkansas, and the other is just south of Laramie on the Wyoming-Colorado state line. There's only two places where diamonds have been found in the United States. And here we have a little display that tells the story of where these diamonds were found, what kind of diamonds are found down there, and why we have diamonds there to begin with. And we see here a little depiction of what ancient Wyoming would have looked like at a time where we had various kinds of volcanic activity. So diamonds come from that part of volcanic activity that would be deep within the ground. So imagine that part of a volcano that would be the vent coming up deep from within the ground. And as that molten rock cools, different kinds of minerals are forming. And remember, minerals make up rocks. So we have different kinds of minerals in different kinds of rocks. And in this case, we have, because of the composition of this particular kind of molten rock, we have diamonds forming. And they're very, very small. We can see a couple of them up here. They're very, very small. They're very, very low grade. We haven't found any diamonds at this point in time that are economical to mine, but it is a definite geological interest. So this is yet another display that we have in the museum, and this one deals not with the ancient animals, but actually with an ancient environment hundreds of millions of years ago which was the kind of environment that was just right for diamonds to form. Now, if you look through the museum, you'll in fact see a variety of different kinds of rock and mineral displays that we haven't talked about today. In fact, because of the time, we haven't spent time talking about each and every display that we have in the museum, but we have many displays here. We have displays on Wyoming State gemstone, jade. We have displays on amethyst and selenite and a variety of other types of crystals. So we encourage people to come to the museum and hunt around and see a variety of different kinds of displays.
Brent, thank you very much for inviting us into the museum. We've enjoyed it immensely. I know our audience has. And if someone wishes to come and visit, how would they find the museum geographically? And is it open to the public?
Well, it's been my pleasure to have you here today. And the Geological Museum is located in Laramie, Wyoming. And the museum is in the northwestern corner of campus. We don't front any streets, but usually what I tell people to do is to get to the northwestern corner of the University of Wyoming campus. That would be on the intersection of 9th and Lewis Street. Walk onto campus just a short distance and ask the first person you see, where's the dinosaur museum? Or where are the dinosaurs? We are open to the public. We're open Monday through Friday from 8 to 5 year-round. We're closed on the holidays, and we are trying to extend our hours to include the weekends. So we encourage people to call. If you'd like to call and check on our hours or some of our special programs that we have here, the number is area code 307-766-4218. Thank you very much.